Wake up, everyone. Today is January 1st, 2026. Happy New Year. While you were popping champagne and finalizing your resolutions, the European Union just made a gamble that could redefine the global financial system or shatter it. As of this morning, the Eurozone has expanded to 21 members. The newest entrant? Bulgaria. On the surface, it looks like a victory lap. The European Central Bank in Frankfurt is lit up in blue and gold. In Sofia, government billboards are everywhere, screaming about unity and prosperity. They've finally ditched the Leviticus. They are now spending, saving, and borrowing in euros. But turn off the TV cameras, look past the fireworks, and you see something terrifying. This country didn't crawl across the finish line, it collapsed across it. The Bulgarian government resigned just weeks before this historic transition. There is no up-to-date national budget for 2026. Half the population didn't even want this currency switch. And in the streets? It's not a parade. It's a riot. We are looking at a nation with the lowest per capita GDP in the EU, the highest income inequality, and a political system so broken they are staring down the barrel of their 8th election in 5 years. Why does this matter to you, sitting in Chicago, London, or Toronto? Why should a tech worker in Silicon Valley or a retiree in Florida care about the Bulgarian lev? Because the last time a corrupt, fiscally unstable Balkan nation lied its way into the euro and couldn't pay the tab, we got the 2010 Greek debt crisis. That crisis nearly destroyed the euro, tanked the S&P 500 by 16%, and sent shockwaves through every 401k in America. Is history repeating itself? Is Bulgaria the new sick man of Europe that's going to infect your portfolio? Today, we are peeling back the layers of this geopolitical onion. We're going inside the wild east of the European Union to figure out if we just witnessed a historic integration, or the lighting of a financial fuse. Buckle up. The markets open in 3 hours. Let's start with the immediate chaos. Imagine if the United States government resigned 2 weeks before switching from the dollar to, I don't know, Bitcoin. That is effectively the level of instability we are seeing in Sofia right now. The transition to the euro today, January 1st, 2026, was supposed to be the crowning achievement of 2 decades of work. It was supposed to be the moment Bulgaria finally sat at the cool kids table with Germany and France. Instead, the government imploded. Back in November 2025, just 2 months ago, the streets of Sofia turned into a war zone. The government proposed a new tax and spending plan, a budget designed to make the numbers look pretty for the European Central Bank. The people weren't buying it. Protests erupted, marking the biggest display of civil unrest in over a decade. By mid-December, the Prime Minister had quit. The cabinet dissolved. The country is currently running on autopilot. Think about the mechanics of this. Adopting a new currency requires massive administrative oversight. You need price controls to stop retailers from gouging customers. You need a budget to handle the conversion costs. You need a steady hand on the wheel. Bulgaria has no hand on the wheel. They are heading into what looks like an 8th election since 2021. To put that in perspective for my American viewers, imagine having a presidential election cycle every 7 months. Perpetual campaigning, perpetual gridlock, perpetual uncertainty. No long-term economic policy can survive that environment. And this isn't just about incompetence, it's about a complete breakdown of trust. I found a quote from a guy named Ivan Peeve, a 34-year-old tech support worker in Sofia. He was out in the cold protesting last month. He said, and I quote, "Every cent you give to this government is going to be stolen. It has never been so visible. When your tax base believes that paying taxes is essentially a donation to organized crime, you don't have a government. You have a kleptocracy. And this brings us to the elephant in the room. The corruption. This isn't just lobbying like we have in Washington. This is old-school, brown envelope, oligarch-level corruption. If you want to understand why Bulgaria is a risk to the euro, you have to look at the players. Transparency International ranks Bulgaria just above Hungary in its Corruption Perceptions Index. It is consistently the bottom of the barrel in the EU. For the last 10 years, the country has been run like a private fiefdom by a cadre of elites. We're talking about figures like former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov and the oligarch Delian Peevski. To the protesters, Peevski is the eminent scryce, the shadow kingmaker. These guys have been probed, investigated, and scrutinized more times than I can count. Yet, neither has been charged. Why? Because when you control the prosecutors, you don't get prosecuted. The EU knows this. Brussels has repeatedly criticized Bulgaria for its failure to uphold the rule of law. They've even frozen recovery funds in the past. So, here is the multi-billion-dollar question: why did the EU let them in? Why hand the keys to the Eurozone vault to a country with no government and a corruption index that reads like a warning label? The answer is cynical, and it's geopolitical. Goran Georgiev, a senior analyst at the Center for the Study of Democracy, calls it external validation and whitewashing. Basically, the pro-EU parties in Bulgaria use their connections in Brussels as a shield. They say, hey, we might be corrupt, but at least we aren't pro-Russian. And the EU buys it. With the war in Ukraine still casting a long shadow over Eastern Europe, and with Serbia flirting with Moscow, Brussels is desperate to lock down the Balkans. They are willing to overlook the missing millions and the rigged contracts just to plant the EU flag firmly in Sofia. But for you, the investor, this is a massive red flag. When political decisions override economic reality, markets eventually punish the mistake. We saw it when the EU let Greece in despite their cooked books. The political will said unity, but the math said bankruptcy. Bulgaria's entry into the Eurozone feels like a geopolitical rushed job. And rushed jobs in finance usually end in liquidity crises. Let's look at the actual numbers. Because if you think the political situation is bad, wait until you see the demographic cliff they just walked off. In economics, we obsess over GDP, interest rates, and PE ratios. But there is one metric that matters more than anything else: people. You cannot have economic growth without a workforce. You cannot have a housing market without buyers. Since joining the EU in 2007, Bulgaria has suffered one of the most catastrophic population collapses in modern history. The country has lost about 16% of its people. Over 1 million Bulgarians packed their bags and left. Imagine if the entire population of California just vanished. That's the scale we are talking about relative to their size. Elena Ivanova, a mother of two protesting in Sofia, put it heartbreakingly well: many of my friends left Bulgaria. I want my sons to remain. But why would they? The freedom of movement in the EU is a double-edged sword. It allows a talented Bulgarian engineer to move to Munich or Amsterdam and triple their salary overnight. Great for the engineer. Devastating for Bulgaria. This has created a hollowed-out economy. The stats look deceptive. Bulgaria's GDP has quadrupled to $110 billion since 2007. Their debt to GDP is under 30%, which sounds amazing compared to the US's 120%. But why is the debt so low? Is it fiscal responsibility? No. It's because the state is paralyzed. They aren't investing in infrastructure, they aren't investing in healthcare, and they aren't investing in the future. And while the GDP went up, who got the money? Bulgaria has the highest income inequality in the European Union. It hasn't changed since 2007. If you are in Sofia, working in tech or finance, you are living like a king. Wages there are twice as high as in the Northeast. But go to the rural regions? It's poverty. It's the EU's poorest region. This creates a two-speed economy. One part is a modern European state, the other is a post-Soviet wasteland. And now, they are locking both those speeds into a single, rigid currency, the euro. This brings us to the immediate threat to your wallet: inflation. Let's talk about the Cappuccino Index. Every time a country joins the euro, the locals have one specific fear: that the coffee shop owner is going to round up the price. If a coffee was 2 lev, suddenly it becomes €1.50. It sounds trivial, but across an entire economy, this rounding up can crush consumer purchasing power. The Bulgarian government knows this. On December 29, just days ago, they announced sanctions on retailers found to have unjustified price increases. They are trying to police the price of bread and milk. History tells us that price controls rarely work. But for Bulgarians, this isn't just about coffee. It's about trauma. In the 1990s, Bulgaria went through a hyperinflationary crisis that wiped out the savings of an entire generation. People saw their life's work evaporate in weeks. That scar tissue is still there. Polls show the country is split down the middle on the euro. Why? Because they don't trust the central bank. They don't trust the government to protect them from price gouging. And here is the kicker for the global market: the Eurozone is not a one-size-fits-all t-shirt. When you join the euro, you give up your ability to print money. You give up your independent monetary policy. If Bulgaria hits a recession, they can't devalue the lev to boost exports. They have to wait for the European Central Bank in Frankfurt to make a move. But the ECB sets rates for Germany and France. They don't set rates for a volatile, corrupt economy in the Balkans. If inflation spikes in Bulgaria because of this switch, the ECB isn't going to raise rates just to help them, because that would hurt the German economy. Bulgaria is effectively putting on a monetary straitjacket while the building is on fire. And who is waiting in the wings to capitalize on this chaos? The bear in the east. We cannot talk about Bulgaria without talking about Russia. Bulgaria has historically been one of the most Russia-friendly nations in the EU. They share a Slavic heritage, a Cyrillic alphabet, and deep energy ties. The current president, Rumen Radev, is widely considered Russia-friendly. He, along with the Nationalist Revival Party, pushed hard for a referendum to stop the euro adoption. They wanted to keep the Leviticus. They wanted to keep Bulgaria's options open. They failed. The euro is here. But the sentiment hasn't gone away. About 40% of Bulgarians want a brand new government, potentially formed around President Radev. Here is the geopolitical nightmare scenario. Imagine a country that uses the euro, has access to the Schengen free travel zone, and sits in NATO councils, but is politically aligned with Moscow. If the pro-Western parties continue to fail, if this euro transition leads to massive inflation and poverty, the pendulum will swing back hard. The next election could sweep a pro-Russian government into power inside the Eurozone. This would be a Trojan horse for Putin. A way to destabilize the EU from within its own currency union. Goran Georgiev, the analyst we mentioned earlier, warned that reversing the euro adoption would be economic suicide. But populist governments love economic suicide if it buys them power. For the US and NATO, Bulgaria is a critical piece of real estate on the Black Sea. If its economy collapses, or if it pivots east, the southern flank of NATO weakens. That creates uncertainty. And Wall Street hates uncertainty. So, we've painted a pretty grim picture. But I'm not here just to scare you, I'm here to prepare you. What happens next? I see 3 scenarios playing out over the next 12 to 24 months. Scenario 1, the Balkan Tiger. In this best-case scenario, the euro acts as a stabilizer. The external pressure from the ECB forces Bulgaria to finally clean up its corruption. Foreign investment floods in, attracted by the low taxes and low wages relative to the rest of Europe. The political chaos settles, and Bulgaria becomes a manufacturing hub for the EU, replacing China in the supply chain. European stocks rally. The euro strengthens against the dollar. Emerging market ETFs with exposure to Eastern Europe soar. Scenario 2, the Sofia stagnation. This is the muddle-through scenario. The government remains unstable. Elections happen every year. The economy grows, but slowly. The brain drain continues. Bulgaria becomes a zombie state within the EU, not big enough to cause a crash, but not healthy enough to contribute. Neutral. The markets price it in. It's just another drag on European growth, keeping the euro weaker than it should be. Scenario 3, the Euroquake. This is the dangerous one. The political unrest in Sofia turns into a revolution. The pro-Russian factions gain power and threaten to exit the euro or default on debts. The corruption scandals explode, revealing billions in missing EU funds. This is your contagion event. Bond yields in Italy and Greece would spike as investors panic about who is next. The euro crashes against the dollar. The S&P 500 takes a hit as risk appetite vanishes globally. The current signals, the resignation of the government, the protests, the lack of a budget point uncomfortably toward scenario 3. Irina Staneva, a 23-year-old psychology student protesting in the cold, said something that stuck with me. It's the feeling that someone has taken away something that partly belongs to me and my friends. We want it back. She was talking about her country's future. But she could easily be talking about your financial stability. We live in a hyper-connected world. A butterfly flaps its wings in Sofia, and a margin call happens in New York. The adoption of the euro by Bulgaria today is a massive gamble. The EU is betting that the currency will civilize the politics. The protesters are betting that the politics will poison the currency. As investors, we need to stop looking at countries as lines on a map and start seeing them as components in a global machine. Bulgaria is a rusty, wobbling cog that was just jammed into the engine of the world's second-largest economy. Here is my call to action for you. 1. Watch the DXY. If the euro weakens because of instability in the East, the dollar gets stronger. That hurts US multinational companies who sell goods abroad. 2. Monitor European banks. Check the exposure of major Austrian and Italian banks to Bulgarian debt. That is where the contagion starts. 3. Don't ignore the geopolitics. If you see headlines about a pro-Russian government taking over in Sofia later this year, it's time to get defensive with your portfolio. Bulgaria has finally joined the club. Now, we have to wait and see if they burn the clubhouse down. Thanks for watching. If you want to stay ahead of the global trends that the mainstream media ignores, destroy the like button and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Class dismissed.